Hi all. Today's subject is motives for European maritime exploration. Now, the last mini-lecture covered broadly some of the motivations for European sea exploration. This mini-lecture adds to that brief overview with greater detail. Early modern Europeans had many reasons for engaging in overseas ventures, some of which I covered in the last lecture. Most Europeans, however, shared common interests, which we can summarize as follows: accumulating wealth, gaining power against their rivals, and spreading Christianity. At its core, this expansionist tendency was driven by commerce. European merchants found themselves starved, metaphorically of course, for gold and silver, which they needed to purchase the Asian spices, silks, gems, and other luxuries which they craved so greatly. Europeans had Mediterranean coral and, increasingly, firearms that they could trade. But other than these items, Europeans produced little to offer in exchange for Eastern luxuries. In relationship to the Asian peoples, the Europeans were thus relatively poor. Now, in part due to this relative poverty, ambitious monarchs and princes adopted violent means of extending their dominions overseas. This extension of power would lead, they hoped, to increased tax and tribute incomes. Finally, Europe's many Christian missionaries had their own goals. They hoped to spread the religion throughout the globe. So all of these motives together shaped the early encounters between Europeans and the peoples of the Indian Ocean basin and of the Americas. It also shaped the subsequent hybrid societies that would emerge in conquered lands. When Christopher Columbus went on his adventures, at a certain point he wrote a letter to the King and Queen of Spain declaring that gold was a treasure that could be used toward any end, and he knew what he was talking about. Christopher Columbus was a native of the Italian city-state of Genoa. Genoese merchants had long traded for gold in North Africa. There, Muslim traders who crossed the Sahara Desert from West Africa brought gold to exchange for a variety of goods. African gold fed into and propelled European trade in the Mediterranean. Population growth, commercial expansion, and intensifying competition among Christian and Islamic states, however, strained the gold supply. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had established a North African foothold in 1415, and they were well placed to seek the solution to this gold supply issue, and I will touch more on the Portuguese position in a future mini-lecture. Indeed, it was the Portuguese who were the first to seek direct access to African gold themselves, eliminating middlemen. Italian merchants made some of the greatest profits in Europe on spices. These were used at the time, much as they are today, both for medicines and as flavoring agents in everyday dishes. Most spices came from the farthest tropical margins of Asia, and as a result, they rose considerably in value as they passed through the hands of the mostly Islamic middlemen in the Indian Ocean and Eastern Mediterranean. Indian pepper and Indonesian nutmeg were but two of many desired drugs and condiments. The Portuguese and other European merchants who sought to purchase these and many other items wished to do so more cheaply by sailing directly to the source, eliminating the middlemen. Sailing directly to the source, however, required one of two passages. Either they had to go around the west coast of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and up into the Indian Ocean basin, or they had to go west and try to find some kind of passage to the Pacific that way. And remember, they actually didn't know that there were two continents here that were in the way. Throughout the Mediterranean basin, slaves were prized as field laborers and household servants. The demand for slaves grew with the expansion of commercial agriculture and the rise of wealthy merchant families. Prices on slaves also rose as the source regions near the Black Sea were cut off by the rise of the Ottomans after 1453. Now, as the word slave suggests, most captives initially came from the Slavic regions up of Eastern Europe, but others were prisoners of war that had been taken in battles or during pirate raids. It was, however, problematic for Christian Europe that it was held strongly that Christians were not permitted to enslave other Christians. So if they wanted to have slaves, they had to go to non-Christian populations. To meet the growing demand of slaves from Christian Europe, increasing numbers of sub-Saharan Africans were transported across the Sahara Desert by caravan into North Africa, where they were then sold for to end up in varying places throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. As with gold, southern European merchants engaged in this trade were quick to seek captives by sailing directly to West Africa, rather than dealing with the merchant middlemen in the northern African regions. Sugar was yet another exotic commodity that was in high and quickly growing demand in Europe. Sugar required large investments of land, labor, and machinery. By the mid-15th century, most sugar was produced by enslaved workers on eastern Atlantic islands. So for example, Portuguese Madeira, marked here by the red and black circle. Cane sugar in the Middle Ages was again seen as both a spice and a drug, and increasingly it became a common commodity in Europe as both a sweetener and a preservative. In fact, it gradually replaced honey in Old World cuisines. But few consumers at the time pondered sugar's growing connection to overseas enslavement. In time, it's the European demand for sugar that would lead to the establishment of the Atlantic slave trade and would force the transportation of millions of Africans unwillingly to the Americas.